I pictured the Chinese philosophers as all naturalists, but the theme of the course is humanity and nature in Chinese thought. So I want to explain the rest of that theme. I want to talk about two different types or varieties of Chinese naturalism, and they're the types from which the name of the course comes. So when we think about guidance in the world, we want to say that both of these, both the humanism and the naturalism in China, are one world conceptions. They don't presuppose a supernatural world or an outside authority. It's part of the natural physical structure. But the humanists are going to emphasize the human sources of ethical guidance. The naturalists are going to emphasize the physical sources of ethical guidance. So it's like a distinction between what is human and what is non-human natural. So this is a different conception of naturalism. The conception that contrasts with the West is naturalism as contrasted with supernaturalism. This is naturalism as contrasted with humanism. And both of them are, in terms of the Western contrast, both versions of naturalism, because they still are one-world conceptions. Humanism, when we talk about it in the Chinese form, is what we sometimes call, for that reason, secular humanism. That is, non-religious humanism, non-divine humanism. And that's what we find in Confucianism. And there are really two versions of this. And this is often not recognized how different this is within Confucianism. Confucius's version is essentially a social, cultural, historical version of humanism. Ethical guidance is the product of a historical culture rolling through time, transmitting from the past and from the sages, and giving us guidance as a historical inheritance. Mencius tries an alternative humanism in which the source of guidance comes from natural human psychology. This is already a kind of tilt toward a more physical naturalism, because it's not going to be in history, but just in the actual physical structure of our psyche. And Mencius is going to claim that that's where we find natural guidance. It's inborn, and it can be mixed with culture, but that the ultimate source has to be from human psychology. Both are human sources, so both count as versions of humanism. Natural naturalism in China is what we associate most commonly with Taoism, but many other schools, as we'll see, will be talking in those terms. It's sometimes called in China sky naturalism. That is the concept that we'll talk about this at the end of this week. This concept of sky naturalism is the concept of a kind of cosmic naturalism, or if you like, even a physical naturalism. It's talk about that they would fill out in terms of yin and yang and qi, and that we could fill out in terms of matter and energy, or baryonic matter and dark matter, or in terms of fermions and bosons. So there can be two different types of this fundamental stuff that makes up the natural world. And it's the distribution of that physical stuff that creates paths, ways, opportunities, openings, things that are possible for us, are made possible by the layout of physical stuff. So if we were putting this in modern physics, we could use John Wheeler's famous statement to explain natural paths in the following way. Space-time tells matter how to move. Matter tells space-time how to curve. So in effect, the paths are made possible by the distribution of matter, and then the path itself is the way that that space-time is curved, and matter and light move through space-time. So in China, these versions of natural naturalism also take two forms. One of them is a kind of exclusive form that insists that you completely eliminate human sources, that you avoid entirely, especially the social cultural guidance, and you rely only on this kind of natural guidance, which for them will probably include the psychological, the natural psychological guidance, but should not include anything social, cultural, or transmitted. In the other version that we'll see in Zhuangzi, we should instead think of natural guidance as blended with human guidance, and we think of human guidance as, in effect, having evolved because of the structure of nature, and therefore evolved in response to the structures that are in nature, and therefore all still physically natural. So we understand physical nature as being the ultimate source of it, and our skill at finding it and following it is what we call De. So this course is going to be about all of those options and more, and the ways they get mixed up. And I'm going to be arguing, as I hinted before, that the way they mix them and match them and add to them and borrow and combine is a way of making progress in their discussion about natural guidance, guidance from nature. And I'm treating it as philosophy, as I said, because I will spot progress. The other way of treating it is not just think of it as having progress, but just looking at the sources of inspiration. So, for example, my account will start with Confucius, and I'm going to treat him as the halting first steps with all of the errors that have to be corrected later. In a religious treatment, you would say, here's Confucius. He's the greatest Chinese philosopher. And whatever he said, well, that's the truth about guidance. And ours is going to be a humanism that goes through progressive phases. We're going to find it responding to criticism, discussion, and internally perceived weaknesses. And the naturalism will do the same thing. So we're looking at philosophers and philosophical processes. This process comes to an end also in a natural way, the same way that it does in the West, by the imposition of a political dynasty at the end of the classical period. But we don't have to get to that story until the very end of class. In our next section, we're going to talk about the other part of the theme, and that is ethics.